Welcome, everyone. My name is Dr. Joseph Orosco, and I teach philosophy at Oregon State University. And I am the co-director of the Anarres Project for Alternative Futures at Oregon State. The Anarres Project is a forum for conversations, initiatives, and projects that try to imagine an alternative future free of exploitation, domination, oppression, war, and empire. And one of the projects that we've tried to do for the past 3 years or so is this project that we call TrekWars at OSU. It's an attempt to try to talk about the ways in which Star Trek and Star Wars, these two mega franchises in science fiction and science fantasy, can help us to make sense of cultural, social, political, economic ideas and happenings in society. This is something that we've done for the past 3 years here at Oregon State. And this year, in 2020, we have not been able to do our usual big gala event on campus because of the COVID-19 pandemic, but we wanted to bring to you a small sort of sampling of Trek Wars. And so I've invited my Trek Wars co-creator to come and do a presentation today on Trek Wars at OSU 2020. In the past 3 years, we've chosen different themes. Our very first one was visions of humanity, and we tried to talk about how the different franchises, Star Trek and Star Wars, might present a future of humanity and what human beings are capable of. Last year, in 2019, we did a program in which we talked about how these two franchises portray women heroes and what they say about the role of women in society. This year, we've decided to go with the theme of villains and to talk a little bit about what these two universes have to say about the problems of villainy and evil and general badness and what that says about our current situation in the world today. And so I wanted to bring my co-creator for Trek Wars at OSU, Dr. Randall Milstein, and I'll let him introduce himself just a little bit to us. So welcome, Dr. Milstein.
Well, thanks, Joseph. It's always great to get to do this with you. And not only do we miss our Trek Wars this year, but we're not going to be able to go to Comic-Con and present like we did in the past as well.
For you, at least, a come flip. You've missed Emerald City up in Seattle, and then probably we're going to be missing Rose City,
as well.
Later this year.
Yeah, and that was really fun last year to give the talk about heroic women at Rose City Comic-Con. It was very well received and a great experience. So we're looking forward to do that again. That's kind of off our plate.
Yeah, that was a lot of fun. I mean, it was great to see. I mean, we had an audience there of almost, I think about 70 or 80 people that showed up to hear us talk about heroic women in these franchises.
Yes, and in a big Comic-Con, that's a nice crowd, you know, when they're split among many different panels at the same time.
Yeah, yeah.
But yeah.
So tell us a little bit about your background. Who are you?
Well, me, who am I? I'm a faculty member at OSU. I've been teaching at OSU now for 30 years. And I am also the astronomer in residence for the Oregon NASA Space Grant. Mostly I teach in the physics department, astronomy-based courses, but also in the College of Earth, Ocean, and Atmospheric Sciences, and also in the University Honors College, where I get to teach 6 or 7 colloquia a year on different aspects of astronomy or things like science and science fiction, and also the art of science and how science and art are you know, actually pretty interdisciplinary mix of things, and that very interesting, and students really respond well, and that it makes it fun for me. But before all that, I actually have a degree in fine art before I became a scientist. So yeah,
You're a Renaissance man.
Thanks for saying that. If only, right? But this has been a really wonderful collaboration over the last several years. And I always remember that before we even began this, it started with you inviting me to come and talk about the science and technology of Star Trek. And from there, we went off to do Trek Wars. And
yeah, so back in 2016, one of the things that the Anarres Project did was a big celebration of the 50th anniversary of the network premiere of Star Trek, and we did a whole sort of different program. And yeah, you were one of the highlights talking about the sort of the cultural and scientific impact of Star Trek. So I always feel a little underprepared when I talk with you during these Trek Wars because you know so many of these universes so well, and so you can speak both. You could be both Team Star Wars and Star Trek.
Yeah, but it's like they say, when you're a little kid, you don't want to push religion onto your children, but there's going to come an age when you're going to have to decide whether it's Star Trek or Star Wars.
That's right. That's right. That's right. That's right. Yeah, I always when I teach my class on Star Trek and philosophy now that came out of that celebration, and I find over the years that I get a lot of more Star Wars folks. So I have a lot of evangelizing I have to do in my classes to sort of get them to see like why Star Trek is something to pay attention to.
Well, one of the things I bring up to my students, I think is very interesting too, is that we have to remember that most of the students we have in our classes right now are in their late teens or early 20s, and they have never known a time when there wasn't Star Wars. You and I, of course, were born when Star Trek was the original Star Trek was going on, and so we've always had a Captain Kirk, but we not when we were younger, but we accepted it and it moved on. But the students have never known a time when there hasn't been a Luke Skywalker
Right.
or a
Right.
Darth Vader or even a Captain Kirk and a Mr. Spock as well.
Yeah, that's
Um,
true. That's true.
it's part of their upbringing. I always bring it up for my students that when I was growing up, I learned to read on a book that said a primer that was see Jane's, see Dick, see Spot run. And if we go down to the bookstore now in downtown Corvallis, the stand of primer books has Yoda on the top with a
Yeah.
sign that says "Learn well, learn or read well, you will." And then all the primers and all the number counting books all are taught to you by Obi-Wan, Yoda, all these Star Wars characters. And that's a complete shift, a huge paradigm shift in how you learn things.
Yeah, yeah, I think that that's right. I mean, I think that the Star Trek folks have sort of learned about that merchandising because I received a book for my birthday last month called "See Spock Run." So there's a whole bunch of these coming out now, and
Fun.
I think it sort of goes to the point about like why we do Trek Wars is because these stories and these narratives have so interwoven themselves into our lives in so many different kinds of ways that even if students aren't necessarily science fiction nerds, they sort of know these stories in some way or another because they're so pervasive, and particularly Star Wars, right? And so there are themes and ideas that they can sort of pick up on, and we've talked about this in previous Trek Wars that you don't need to be a science fiction person to know what a lightsaber is or
Or the
the
sound of a lightsaber.
yeah, the sound of the lightsaber. So this is partly why we do this, right? Is because we find that this is a kind of way in which we can spark interesting conversations about what's going on in through society because of the way that they're reflected in Star Trek and Star Wars.
Yes, they become what's commonly referred to as a mind virus.
Yeah.
uh, I'll always ask the question to people, what are those furry little creatures on Endor, and, The Empire Strikes Back, what are those things? And people always tell me, well, those are Ewoks. And I will say, well, how do you know that? Well, everybody knows that. I says, yes, but they're never mentioned by name in any Star Wars movie. Where did you get that from?
Yeah.
That's the mind virus. It's just out there, and they got it from a McDonald's Happy Meal or a toy they had, or maybe a cartoon later on TV, but they're never mentioned by name. And actually, Luke Skywalker's home planet is never mentioned until several films into the series, and yet people always know that he grew up on Tatooine. Uh, that's the pervasiveness of the mind virus.
Yeah. So Star Wars canon is pervasive culturally.
Yeah.
Well, so let's get into our theme for this year. We settled on this question about villains and what villains have to say about these franchises and what we can learn about villainy from these franchises. This is villains is something that's an important kind of theme for science fiction narratives because you often have conflict and struggle going on in a lot of sci-fi. But it seems that focusing on the kinds of villains that are mentioned in science fiction can really tell us a lot about the cultural anxieties of a certain kind of era. And I know that you focus in a lot on this kind of question about the history of science fiction and the kinds of villains that it focuses on. So can you tell us a little bit about what you think the role or the history of villains have been in science fiction?
Sure. Let me see if we can get these slides to come up. Take a look. Let's share the screen here. I hope that's centered. Is that okay, Joseph?
Yeah, that seems good.
Everybody's in the picture?
Yep.
Great. Um, yeah, interestingly enough, um, the whole idea of villains, good people and bad people, is a long held theme, of course, because throughout history we always try to manage our behavior in a society. And we have to remember, though, that the whole idea of goodness and badness, especially goodness versus badness, are really made up concepts. These are usually self constructs that society sets up as boundaries. And then we inherit those. And then we decide based upon old books we have, maybe a myth, a parable, maybe some artwork that's out there, uh, pervasive philosophies, or even what our current culture might suggest based on its situation, and then insist as an innate difference between good and bad behaviors. And so we have to be mindful of that when we start looking at these questions. And we have to remember that when villains are portrayed, good villains cannot simply be an obstacle that's put in the way of a hero during a story. They really need to represent some overarching idea, or maybe some conflict, maybe one that's or a concept that's maybe in conflict with everything else. And it has to mean something to the audience. And what it has to mean is something equal to whatever our hero is offering the tale. And what we find in a lot of stories, especially in Star Trek and Star Wars, is that often the villain is kind of a shadowy reflection of the hero himself or herself. And this makes any villain who is conflicted inside them really a more interesting character for us to take part in the story. Now, I also think that, for me at least, a really effective villain is one whose villainy makes sense to me. We don't have to be sympathetic with the villain. We don't have to like them, but we really do need to understand what drives them forward. And really good villains tend to be quite intense. They're usually very charismatic. They tend to be very unpredictable in their behaviors, and they have a really steadfast belief that whatever it is they're doing is totally justified, and that whatever their intentions are, those intentions are righteous. And I think that that combination makes the villain super scary and usually extremely dangerous. Now, I also think that a really effective villain tends to be someone who is driven. They're usually quite ruthless, remorseless. I think that they're psychologically consistent as well in their behaviors. And one thing we need to remember when we're enjoying a story of some kind is that villains don't think that they're villains.
Mm.
Villains think that they're heroes, and what they're doing is proper, and they're justified in it. Now, one of the interesting things, and as you mentioned before about the history of this, is if you go back and look at villains as they're portrayed in science fiction, especially over the last 100 years or so, the villains tend to reflect what's happening in science or in the society at large around us. And if you really want to know what group of people is disturbing your culture at that time or your society, look at how the villains are portrayed. And I think you can especially see this as how alien villains are portrayed in science fiction. And if we were to go back to the 1920s when the first really kind of great science fiction film Metropolis came out, that's really reflecting some of the anxiety of the really start of the Industrial Revolution in terms of modern Industrial Revolution, assembly lines, things of that nature. And by the end of the 20s, you're starting to see the rise of fascism too. So mechanical marching people, really reflects that. But by the early 30s, you've got the Scopes trial has taken place here in the United States, the whole conflict with evolutionary teaching in schools, and who appears but King Kong, nature gone wild. And by the 1940s, you have a lot of serial science fiction that's playing in movie theaters, and one of the most successful was Flash Gordon. And it just happens to be that Flash's nemesis and the enemy of everything is Ming the Merciless. He just happens to look Asian. just happens to be the people we were fighting at the time. By the 1950s, you have aliens who are coming that we can't tell if they're aliens. They infect our bodies, take us over. This is really a great reflection of McCarthyism at the time, the fear of communism, the Red Scare. By the time you get to the 60s and Star Trek comes along, the villains are very reflective of what is happening in our society at large. You see a whole plethora of villains that include, topics that deal with racism. You see people coming along, they're talking about feminism in those shows, aliens who are, outside of us trying to take us over. So very reflective of that. And by the 70s, you have Star Wars come out. You also have Close Encounters. And the aliens are benevolent in many cases and friendly, and they're here to help, and they're trying to make contact with us. And you see that maybe in some of the Eastern European countries at that time, trying to reach out to Western cultures. By the time you get to the late 70s, early 80s, though, you have Alien, you have the Terminator. These are vicious, predatory type, characters as the villain. And I think this really reflects what's starting to happen in our society at that time. You're starting to shift towards a Reagan type of era. And you also have the Borg then come out in the 80s. And again, this is the fall of Eastern Bloc countries. Soviet Union is just starting to fall apart. And the whole idea of people losing their uniqueness to some overarching other culture coming in. And that is totally reflected with the Borg. We are the Borg. We will, assume your uniqueness. You will be added to the collective. And then you have films in the last 20 years or so that are very interesting. Battle for Los Angeles, District 9, where aliens are invading, always being invaded. And you think about that xenophobia that's actually taking place right now in our own country by the politics that we have. And I always ask students about this: the battle for Los Angeles. Why couldn't it have been the battle for St. Louis or the battle for Bismarck, North Dakota? Well, because LA is close to the US-Mexican border. So you set an invasion close where you already have this fear in many people. District 9, you're taking aliens and putting them into a Soweto-like ghetto. And the story actually takes place in South Africa. And then you have more current films like A Quiet Place, where the aliens are here, and if they hear you, they hunt you. So again, don't speak, don't have a voice about anything, or you're going to be, hunted down possibly.
Yeah.
And then if you go to even the current situation now, many of the villains, interestingly enough, are corporate. And I think this says a lot, because it's not what villains are in a story, but what they represent that really matters. And how we decide to handle that villainy or the villains themselves, and especially if they're other, not like us, is really compelling. And it really illuminates a presence or premise, and it asks this really fundamental question of us: just who is the villain here? And I think that Westworld currently is a really good example of that, in that you have the Delos Corporation, you have Insight, one of the other corporations, and they're trying to do something that they think is good for everybody. They haven't asked anybody if they wanted it to happen or not, but they decided they were going to do that. This is also then reflected in other science fiction recently too. Say, I know you're a big fan of The Expanse, and also in the Firefly Serenity universe as well, with Paxilon hydrochloride that they try to use to pacify populations. Blue Sun Corporations of Aldenet. Who makes these choices? Why do these people think that they have the ability to make a choice for everyone else? Because they think people are bad, and they think they're good, and the people think, well, maybe they're villains, and why are they doing this to us? So I think that's the interesting premise, that just who is the villain? And it goes all the way back to the first slide. Who decides in our culture what's the difference between good and bad behavior? And why is one villainous and the other not?
Yeah, I mean, I think Westworld is really interesting in this because it brings together so many different kinds of threads of science fiction, even from the very beginnings of the genre, right? Because the question of who is the villain in Westworld between the sort of the hosts and the humans, right? This is a sort of a question that goes back to Frankenstein, Mary Shelley's
Yeah.
Frankenstein, right, over 100 years ago. And so this kind of question of like, who is the real villain? Is it the monster or is it Victor Frankenstein, who is the monster? And you know, as the story unfolds, it becomes very clear that the kind of perpetrator of harm is not the monster itself necessarily, but Frankenstein, who is unable to share any kind of feelings of sympathy or empathy with his creation. And it's all about his ego and his own sort of moral complexity, and the monster is reacting to all of that. And so Westworld sort of plays on this kind of question of like, you know, the humans who have created these lifelike androids, like who, like the corporations, like what responsibility do they have to these creations, the synthetic life they've made? And Westworld also then sort of plays a lot with these kinds of dystopian themes about like, you know, how dangerous is our technology with our AI, our collection of data, right? And the fact that our lives are built around so many different kinds of algorithms. So it brings together so many of these different kinds of themes of sci-fi that I think it makes it a really sort of excellent kind of mirror, so to speak, to our society. So it's like a combination of Frankenstein with Black Mirror and other series that I really like, in ways that I think are really kind of evocative. And I haven't seen all of the latest third season, so I'm plowing my way through it to try to make sense of it. But what I like about this narrative is I never really know what's going on. It always keeps surprising me in this kind of way. But you're right. There's a kind of way in which, you know, we're a theme that's been developing, maybe even before now, in the past 20 years or so, sort of following the kind of cyberpunk element, is this question about the dangers of corporations in our lives, and that corporations become some kind of danger in controlling our lives, reducing our autonomy. And so rather than having a certain kind of central figure be the villain, it's this kind of corporate shadow world that is behind everything that takes place in our ordinary lives that we may not know about. This goes back, of course, to the Matrix, right? But you see that theme being played out a lot in a lot of sort of recent sci-fi, the sort of dangers of the corporation, which is probably another theme that we can pick up in another episode, right? To
Oh, it'd
sort
be
of think
great.
about, just like thinking about, like as you said, in Firefly and The Expanse, The Matrix, all of these kinds of things, that like the danger of the villainous corporation.
Yeah, and I think one of the interesting themes that's coming out in Westworld and a lot of other these stories as well is at what point do we address the question of free will? And that's really big in the Westworld theme is these machines or androids have free will and it came about, and yet they're not going to be treated equally.
Right.
No matter what, they're going to be considered an object. And then you have the objectification, especially of the women. The
Yeah.
powerful, really powerful characters in this story are women, except for one villain, who is Ed Harris's character. And that whole object of free will and how they're treated is really important in that storyline. And that then people in the corporation, especially, are using what they really want as a tool against them, especially in the case of Maeve.
Yeah.
All she wants is her daughter, and yet
Yeah.
she's then used and abused and told that she could have that, not knowing that she can't, and is then set on a path that she thinks she's choosing, but
Yeah.
she really doesn't, isn't.
Yeah, that's a whole sort of discussion in itself, right? There's sort of unpack these kinds of things.
Yeah.
But one of the things that we often do with TrekWars, we sort of place it in kind of a debate format. We've done this in the past. One of the things that we decided to do was to sort of compare villains and sort of see what we can learn about from these different kinds of villains. And so we've each chosen what we consider to be the most significant villain in either Star Trek or Star Wars. And so when we turn to that part, and I'll share a little bit about what I think is the most significant villain in the Star Trek universe. So let me see if I can get to this. Okay.
Yay.
So Right. As you were talking about, the villains described in both of these franchises are always really different and very, very colorful. And a lot of people tend to really identify with some of these kinds of characters. Right. The Klingons have always been a perennial kind of favorite in terms of cosplay and favorites. And it seems like there's so much attention paid to like when they change their look. And so through the 50 years of Star Trek, the Klingons have had so many different kinds of appearances and what they sort of represent and look like that it sends fans into tizzies about the ways in which the Klingons are represented. But this is one of the most sort of consistent villains in the Star Trek universe. And of course, the sort of grand villain of Star Wars, Darth Vader, which I know that you'll talk about a little bit to see, but of course, one of my favorite villains, even from when I was a kid. There's something just so iconic about him. But talking about Star Trek and what is interesting about the way that villains are portrayed there, I think you're right that you see in Star Trek and its villains a kind of a mirror toward the cultural anxiety of the times, and you've talked a little bit about this, and I think that you see this reflected in sort of the development of the sort of some of the most significant Star Trek villains. Right back in the original series in the 1960s, you had the original Klingons, and they're portrayed as really sort of savage and brutal. And the makeup that was done on them was to make them darker skinned, and indeed, as you see here, reminiscent of this kind of Ming the Merciless makeup, down to the sort of Fu Manchu beards and the upraised eyebrows, right? So it's very clearly evocative of sort of Asian stereotypes. And this is, right, of course, at an era in which the United States is becoming directly involved with the war in Vietnam, right? So Star Trek appears in television in 1966, right, sort of right as things are really ramping up in Southeast Asia. And so the Klingons sort of have this kind of role of a mirror of the foes of Vietnamese, Cambodian, right? This kind of wariness of communism going on in Southeast Asia. By the time you get to the late 80s and 90s, the villains really change, and the most significant kind of threat to the Federation is the Borg. And as you've mentioned, right, a lot of things are changing here with the fall of the Soviet Union in 1989 and 1990, and the rise again of sort of corporate globalization, right? And so you start to have a lot of discussion about globalization in the 1990s, early 2000s, about the ways in which multinational corporations are taking control all over the world, a kind of McDonaldization of the world. And so I think that there's a kind of anxiety about, as we talked about, sort of losing cultural uniqueness, being swallowed up by this kind of global hegemony of McDonald's and Nike and Starbucks. And so I think that the Borg kind of represent this kind of fear of assimilation by a big nameless collective. By the time you get to the 2000s, the big major threat to the Federation becomes the Dominion. And the Dominion is led by these changelings, the founders, who are not corporeal in the sort of way that we sort of think about humanoids. They're this kind of amorphous blob. And they decide to engage in a kind of genocidal war against what they call the solids in the alpha quadrant of the galaxy, invoking their aides, the Vorta, and then their fearsome warriors, the Jem'Hadar. It's probably one of the most costly wars in Federation history, as depicted in Deep Space Nine. And so I think here the fear is of global terrorism and the sort of threat to our foundational ways of life. And the thing about the founders is that they can take any shape and they can look like whoever it is. They can appear like anyone. And so I think that this sort of caught on to this kind of cultural anxiety in the early 2000s that we didn't know where the terrorists were. They sort of strike us in our most ordinary and everyday life, right? Taking out the Twin Towers, blowing up airplanes, right? All of these kinds of stuff, the sort of everyday things that we sort of take for granted are at a threat by global terrorism. And so I think that the Dominion was this kind of representation of this amorphous enemy that could look like anyone, but could be everywhere. But I think the most dangerous Star Trek villains are none of these, even though these are really interesting characterization. I think the most dangerous Star Trek villains are the Starfleet Admirals. I think the Federation in itself is, in sense, the most dangerous element to itself, to the well-being of this utopia that Gene Roddenberry created in 1966 of the Federation. So to explain what I mean by this, here's a representation of, I think, some of the kinds of ways in which these admirals act. On the top here, you have Admiral Ileana Nechayev, and she appears in a lot of the Next Generation episodes. But she is someone who, in a couple of episodes, does some really, really kind of dastardly things that kind of represent the imperial nature of Starfleet, or the ways in which Starfleet is not just a kind of a benign self-defense force, but can act in a way that acts like old sort of imperial powers. In the episode Journey's End, in which it has to deal with the Federation Cardassian conflict, there's this this one colony of humans that are descendants from Native Americans who flew away from Earth hundreds of years ago, and they've been living on this planet for about 20 years. And Nechayev comes on to the Enterprise and orders Picard to remove them from their homes in order to protect them in this treaty negotiations with one of their enemies, the Cardassians. And Picard has this huge kind of moral quandary, because he tells her, look, these are people who have had their history has been defined by being displaced by large imperial political powers. And Nechayev says, I don't care, get it done. And so Picard feels torn about his moral obligations to this marginalized group that has been perpetually oppressed, and that it will be continued to be oppressed by Starfleet if Nechayev has her ways. Nechayev is also in the episode Descent in the Next Generation. She gives Picard a browbeating because he decided not to commit genocide against the Borg. In previous episodes, he had the opportunity to infect the Borg collective with a virus that would have wiped them all out, and he chose not to do it because he's a good guy and he doesn't like to commit war crimes. And Nechayev says, that was the wrong decision. You should have killed them all. And Nechayev is never she never comes to a bad end. She's always sort of seen as a real kind of, hard and tough person, but she is very not empathetic with people on the opposite end of the stick that she wields. The next interesting admiral is Admiral Leyton at the top there. And again, this guy is interesting on the one, just kind of a weird thing, because he doesn't have a first name in canon. He's never, sometimes it's James, sometimes it's Thomas. It depends, right? The Star Trek wiki is really vague on who this guy was. But what's clear is that he saw himself as the military commander of the Federation. So in the two-parter episode in DS9, Paradise Lost, the Dominion, one of the changelings, come to Earth, and there's a view that the changelings have infiltrated Earth, and so Leyton orders martial law all throughout Earth, and so there are uniformed Starfleet soldiers on blocks with phaser rifles, and people are limited to what they can do. And he sees this as necessary for the security of Starfleet, and decides that he, in fact, is going to do these false flag operations to show that the Dominion has much more wider ability to attack Earth, so that he can mount a military coup and put himself as the military commander of Earth. And so this kind of notion of fear and xenophobia has overcome his sense of the importance of liberty and autonomy in the Federation, and he's willing to sacrifice all of that for the sake of security from this foe that, it turns out, has not really done all the things that he's claimed that they've done. Possibly could, they are a threat, but it's this question between of liberty and security. And what's interesting about this episode is that this series of episodes came out in 1996, so this was way before the discussions of global terrorism in the 2000s after 9/11. DS9 in some sense was predicting the kinds of things that we would see happen with the Patriot Act. The most recent sort of dangerous Admiral in the Star Trek universe is Admiral Katrina Cornwell that appeared in the Discovery series. She appears in the first season in 2017. And this is, if you haven't seen Discovery yet, this tries to depict the first Klingon war between Starfleet and the Klingons. And the war goes very badly for the Federation at one point, and the Federation is on the losing end. The Klingons are about to attack Earth. And as a last-ditch effort, the admirals of Starfleet decide that the best way to win the war would be to destroy the homeworld of the Klingon Empire and essentially commit an act of genocide against the Klingons. So this theme of genocide keeps coming up with the Starfleet admirals. This seems to be like their thing to go to when they want to protect Earth, is like, well, let's just kill everybody. And they get talked down mostly. I mean, Picard doesn't convince Nechayev that the genocide of the Borg would be a bad thing. She remains committed to that. But in Discovery, Michael Burnham, the main character, is able to talk down Katrina Cornwell and tell her that genocide of the Klingons would not solve the problems, and this is not something that the Federation would ever do. And it's only because there's almost a near mutiny on the USS Discovery that she decides that maybe genocide isn't a bad, that Cornwell decides that maybe genocide isn't a good thing to do. So, I mean, I think that what you see represented in Star Trek overall is that sometimes the people at the top of this power structure are the most dangerous to the well-being of the Federation. It's not necessarily the Klingons or the Borg or the Dominion even. Those are interesting characters, but often it's our own leaders who are more likely to commit more harm to us and to violate our trust and our ideals than the aliens are. And so I think that this maps on to some really interesting psychological and ethical theory that's come out in the past few years. Simon Baron-Cohen, who is at Cambridge University, who is actually the brother of Sacha Baron-Cohen, the comedian. Simon is actually a very big clinical psychologist, and in 2011 he wrote a book called The 0 Degrees of Empathy. What he tries to do there is to show that when you have structures of power that have sort of in a pyramid structure where there's a small number of leaders at the top and a large, wide variety of subordinates below them, that this kind of leadership often leads to what he calls empathy erosion. That is, that leaders at the top frequently lose the ability to imagine and to care about other people's feelings. So that in some sense, power corrupts. It's a kind of place, structurally speaking, that if you get into these kinds of leadership positions in hierarchical structures, you start to lose and not care about how other people feel. And you see this, for instance, with Nechayev. She has almost no empathy with either the Native Americans or with Picard. You see this with some of the other kinds of admirals that I didn't have a chance to talk to, but this one study by, I think it's George, in 2019 shows that having power over others tends to increase your tendency to be selfish, and it diminishes your ability to use moral reasoning when you're making decisions about having power over other people. And so there are some cases in which there are admirals who you see this decide, look, I'm gonna do this one thing, I'm gonna pursue this technology that will give me immortality, and I'm gonna pursue this goal to the ends, and I don't care who gets in my way. That's a real thing, right? That happens in leadership, according to this one theory. And people lose the ability to have moral imagination because of the power that they're given. And then finally, this really interesting study came out in 2014 by Hogeveen and crew, that having power might actually alter the brain. So this is brain science. It might change your brain so that you lose a certain kind of capacity, what they call motor resonance, which is the capacity to mirror other people's emotional expressions. So, you know, one of the things that's unique about primates and particularly humans, and as opposed to other animals, is that we have this capacity to be able to look carefully into the face of other people and to read their emotional state from the ways in which we can sort of feel and mirror what's going on in other people's eyes. What these folks found in this study is that having power uh, puts you into situations in which you frequently have to override that capacity. And so you start to learn how not to care. And that actually modifies your brain structure and chemistry so that not only are you start to develop this habit, you start to lose the ability, perhaps biologically speaking, of having a caring kind of attitude. So, I mean, I think you see all of these things represented in in the ways in which Star Trek represents the the admirals acting in various kinds of ways. And so I think Star Trek says some very interesting things about power. And like I said, I think that the alien threats are always really interesting in how they are depicted in Star Trek. Questions about, like you said, cultural anxieties, but there's a real subversive message here. I think that there's a worry about what power does to people, even in a utopian setting. And so I think the Federation is a kind of ambiguous utopia this way, because while there's no hunger, there's very little poverty and war on Earth. There's still power in a hierarchical way, and that can be a dangerous thing for ethical decision making. So my vote for the most villainous people in the Star Trek universe are the leaders of Starfleet.
Well, it's interesting. Some of the things you were describing in those three studies really sounds like sociopathic behavior.
Mm-hmm.
And it would be interesting to try to find out if that behavior is a result of reaching power or that leadership positions draw people who already have those behaviors, who already lean towards uh, a lack of empathy or a sociopathic type of being.
Yeah.
Uh, it would be interesting to, you know, see what's a chicken and egg situation there.
Yeah, I think what's interesting, at least about the Baron Cohen study, is he calls this a process of erosion, so that
Yeah,
leadership itself is something, a certain kind of leadership, at least when you have power over other people, that it can slowly start to erode any kind of ability that you might have had going into the job. So that, the old adage about power corrupting is that in some sense, a certain kind of
absolutely.
power can really start to affect your ability to feel for other people. And that last study, if it's true, then it actually modifies your brain, right? I think that this really raises some interesting question about how should we structure power and institutions, and what would actually be a utopian kind of way of thinking about power. Is the Starfleet model of a kind of quasi-military really all the best kind of way of structuring power? Because it seems like the admirals, right? There's so many kooky admirals in this story. I think it'd be really interesting to sort of talk about, like, how else could we do this? And I think this is something, that I think that Firefly sort of portrays really well, is that, right, is that you can have this kind of this star alliance kind of power that thinks of itself as being very benevolent and a guardian of the galaxy, and the fact is that it is really corrupt and dangerous, right? And so that sort of leads to the war in Firefly, right? So it's kind of like the anti-Trek, and I think that Star Trek hints, at least, that that's really possible.
I always think it's interesting too that need to commit genocide all the time.
Mm.
How they can rectify that or justify that versus the prime directive. Don't interfere. If you go to another world, don't do anything bad. But at the same time, we don't want to corrupt you in any way and let you evolve on your own. But we're going to wipe this other culture completely off the map.
Yeah.
And that seems like a really strange dichotomy of thinking going on there.
Yeah, I think it's usually portrayed that, like, when it comes to questions of survival, people be willing to do all sorts of really awful things. And I think that that's true. And I think that the strength of Star Trek is always how the admirals get talked back from that point of that brink. And so that's an interesting thing. And I know that a lot of people often say that things like Star Trek Discovery and maybe even Picard are too dystopian for them, or too dark in kinds of ways, because they portray the Federation as too morally compromised and the world is too depressing. But I think if you look carefully, this has been a worry all throughout this series, that power is something that is potentially corrupting, and the people who get up there usually turn out to be some really awful folk, right? Very rare that a Starfleet admiral is a good person. Even Kirk, Right. When Kirk gets up there, he like has all these violations of the Prime Directive and all these kinds of things. And so he's not a great admiral either, even though he's one of our big heroes. But there's something about power, it seems, in Starfleet that goes to people's heads.
It's interesting. I think Kirk is interesting parallel almost with Darth Vader too, because they're both driven by emotion
Mm-hmm.
rather than thinking. Kirk requires Spock to be his thinking mode
Yeah.
and to talk him down,
Yeah.
and he's just totally emotionally driven. And of
Yeah.
course, that's what we know is the downfall of Vader, is he totally is driven by his emotion, and he's not clearly thinking and comprehending the Force.
Well, that's a good segue. So let's hear about what you consider
So,
to be
so
the significant Star Wars villains and what they
oh,
mean to us.
fun. Well, uh, let's share a screen here. Um, I think that Star Wars wouldn't be Star Wars without its villains, and we have a grand selection of them that show up almost a new one, almost every one of the different films. But I think that when you're young and you watch Star Wars for the very first time, you tend to identify with certain characters. You tend to identify with Luke Skywalker, maybe Leo Organa, and now with Rey. And I think that's because they're all good to a fault. And as you grow older, though, in polling students in my classes, I found that most of them gravitate towards Han Solo. And that's who they identify with in their late teens and into their 20s. And I think that's because he's basically good, but at the same time, he's a rule breaker. He is definitely a scoundrel, and he's what you'd call a bad boy. But there are other versions of this that show up in the Star Wars universe as well. You have characters like Poe Dameron, Cassian Andor, Jyn Erso, I think, falls into that. Mando, the Mandalorian, definitely. Zori Bliss is portrayed that way, and Asajj Ventress is also a character like this, and people tend to identify with this fact. And it's always in this specific age group, I think, because as you grow into adulthood, from what I found, again, polling people and talking to them, even my own mother, who is 86 years old, the only character she thinks that is identifiable, to be identified with, is Darth Vader. And that's because as we grow into adulthood, we start to understand and appreciate that underlying iconic hero's journey tale that's given to us in Star Wars. And the only person we can really relate to as an adult as the villain, which is Darth Vader. And I think that Vader is also probably the most intriguing for me and maybe essential character in the entire series. It binds everything together through 9 films. But I think this also really complicates our ideas about villains then. That, gosh, he's this villain, and like you said, this iconic villain in your own life, even as a young person, but this is the one that we identify with as an adult. That's an interesting take on our own views. And then it complicates our view of all other villains. Now, I think a number of people argue that Darth Vader is an evil psychopath. And I had someone bring this up to me. I was giving a talk in a museum several years ago and about Star Wars, and I told the person I didn't agree with that. I think that premise about Vader is completely wrong. I think Vader's probably a sociopath. He does really bad things, but he does understand what he's doing is bad. He knows it's not the right thing to do. He does it anyway because he can convince himself in some manner, like I said in the first set of slides, that he's being heroic. What he's doing is correct. He is very driven by that. What I would say, though, is that Vader is not evil either. He's bad. Even his own son, as I quoted here, Luke Skywalker says, "Your thoughts betray you, Father. I feel the good in you, the conflict." And Vader's response is, "There is no conflict."
Mm-hmm.
But there is. And in the end, that redeems him. He is able to make a judgment between what is good behavior and incorrect behavior, bad behavior. And he saves his son. His son was willing to give his life because of how he felt for people. And Vader understood that his emotions had been driving him, but probably not the right emotions. And in the end, what he does is destroy evil, which is the Emperor, Palpatine, or Darth Sidious. And we have to remember this. C.S. Lewis said this very good in his writings that evil is not the opposite of good. Bad is the opposite of good. Evil is the absence of good. And Vader had good in him. Even his son knew that. The Emperor was without good. Even right up to the very final film that we've seen, The Rise of Skywalker, that evil still persisted. And there was no good there. And Vader was not that person. But when I look at the Star Wars stories, and I want to find a villain who I think that really adds to the story and also is the reason the story even is driven forward, is someone a lot of people might not think about. And I think that is Count Dooku. I think he's very compelling. His story and what he adds to the canon is really important. And Dooku was born an aristocrat on his world, but his family abandons him. You have to think about what that would do to a young person. He then is picked up, he's raised and educated in the Jedi Temple, and he becomes the Padawan, basically the apprentice to Master Yoda, the highest of all the Jedi. And he himself rises to be the Jedi Master. And his Padawan is Qui-Gon Jinn, who then would take on his own role within the canon itself. But he becomes disillusioned because he's a political idealist. The compromises that were taking place that you talked about in Star Trek, the similar thing. He couldn't stand that. He didn't like to see the Jedi involved in politics and making these compromises. He thought they had a specific mission to go out and do things. And so he leaves. But what does he do? He doesn't try to change that situation. He doesn't try to help in any way and make people see it. He goes back to his home world and reclaims his title as aristocrat, as the Count of Sereno. And then he uses that aristocratic bearing and the ability to talk down to others. When you see him talk to anyone in the series, it's always talking down to them. He's also, of course, portrayed by Christopher Lee. He was about 6'4" or 5 tall, so he was looking down on people
actor.
all the time too.
Yeah, great actor.
But there's just that delivery of this, in this line that I quoted here. What if I told you that the Republic was now under the control of a Dark Lord of the Sith? ? Just bringing it up casually when he's actually involved in this. Never even bothers him. But what happens in his return after he's an aristocrat is he actually turns to the dark side, and he takes on the name Darth Tyrannus, and he becomes the apprentice to the Sith Lord Darth Sidious, who we also know is eventually Senator Palpatine. At this time, he will become Emperor Palpatine. And Dooku actually serves for over a decade as Darth Sidious' apprentice, and his total goal is to undermine the Republic, to totally knock down democracy, and to instill the senator then as the emperor. And at the same time he's doing this, he's overseeing the development of two armies, the separatist droid army and also the Republic's clone army. And when he makes the clone army, he gives a chip to the clone manufacturers that's embedded with Order 66, whose sole purpose is, when that order is given, the Jedi are to be destroyed on the spot. And so this is a really underhanded, really nefarious set of dealings that are going on here over a long period of time, and on the sly, totally in secret. And eventually, Dooku becomes the president of the Confederacy of Independent Systems. And he's the person then that leads this pan-galactic separatist movement to break away from a democratic republic. And what he does then, by doing this, is manipulate the entire galaxy into a war that then pits the two armies against each other that he developed, the droid army and the clone army. And at the same time, he has personally trained General Grievous to run the droid army, especially in how to duel with lightsabers and things, because Dooku was a very famous duelist with lightsabers himself, probably only the equal, apparently, to Master Yoda. And on the sly, though, he broke something called Darth Bane's Rule of Two. And that is, when there's a Sith, there's always two, a master and a serving apprentice. And the master was Darth Sidious, and Dooku was his serving apprentice. But on the sly, Dooku takes on an apprentice of his own, and that is Naugh's Ventress. And he does this because he thinks with her at his side, then he can overthrow and kill Sidious and become the Sith Lord. That doesn't work out too good for him, and he's supposed to kill Veenstra, and she doesn't. She gets away. He takes on another apprentice, Savage Opress, who actually is in cahoots with Ventress to try to kill Dooku, but she's found out. And eventually he takes on even a third. He doesn't even learn from his other problems that this is, his master knows this is going on. He takes on a fallen Jedi, Quinlan Vos, who then is actually rescued in a change of heart by Anarres Ventress eventually. But he's doing this all on this underhanded, this whole thing. It drives a whole set of storylines throughout the canon involving bounty hunters, Obi-Wan's connection with Ventress especially. And you see this in a lot of the television. The animated series drives a lot of this. But this is all because of Dooku and his behaviors. And in the end, he gets into several very vicious duels with the Jedi. One with Master Yoda, and two with Obi-Wan and Anakin. And in one of them, he slices Anakin's arm off, which sets up a whole series of things within the canon as well. But years later, when they fight again at the Battle of Coruscant, Dooku loses both of his arms. Right. Anakin slices them both off in a real fancy dual move, and he's on his knees, basically asking, for mercy. And instead, under the command of the Emperor, who is actually Darth Sidious, and the command is given in Sidious's voice, not the Emperor's voice, Anakin executes him cold-bloodedly, beheads him on the spot. And even though Dooku dies, his plans of 10 years, all these underhanded moves, leads to the complete destruction of the Jedi Order, because Order 66 is given. Mm-hmm. And it's also then starts the rise of the Galactic Empire. Palpatine, the Senator, will become the Emperor. That's the guise of Darth Sidious, the Darth Sith Lord. And the minute that Anakin takes his head, Anakin Walker's fate is sealed. He now goes to the dark side and becomes Darth Vader, the apprentice to Darth Sidious. So I think that Dooku is the one that really drives this story along in some ways, and his villainy. And the Darth Sidious knew this, because when he's beheaded, the first thing he says to Anakin Skywalker is, "You did well, Anakin. He was too dangerous to be kept alive." So he even knew his own apprentice was a dangerous person and had to be executed or gotten rid of or killed in some way. So I think that that way really drives this story forward, is Dooku's villainous sleight of hand that goes on. And it's just amplified by his aristocratic bearing, his feeling that he knows better and that he's better than everyone else, bragging about his dueling, when he's in these fights with these Jedi. So I think he's a pretty nasty villain in the Star Wars universe.
Interesting. What I find interesting in both of these universes then is this kind of concern with excuse me, the kind of fragility of democracy.
Oh yeah.
And this worry about shadow players. Right. Excuse me. I know that Lucas had some concerns about this, right? So he thought that this was a big allegory, right, for American politics. Star Wars was. Is there a lesson in Dooku for us, politically speaking?
You have 2 or 3 hours, so I can start listing them. Yeah, I think it goes back to what you said about the Starfleet Admirals too. Dooku gets some power, and it corrupts him, so that he thinks he can take the next step, take out the person above him, and then corrupt people below him with his behaviors, and that pitting, there's no problem. I'll just make an army over here and I'll make an army over here. Mm-hmm. And then I'll mix them up on the chessboard and see what happens. See how
Right.
that falls out. We see that happening all the time. We pit adversaries against each other so that we don't have to do the fighting ourselves.
Right.
And I think that, you know, he was certainly being manipulated by Darcidius as well, because he just says, I thought this was my plan all along. This was my plan all along. But you see that the politics that you were talking about that Lucas was dealing with. I know we've talked about this before, that there's a scene in one of the prequels where Senator Amidala is watching the vote to make Palpatine kind of the head of the Senate.
Mm-hmm.
They weren't going to call him emperor at that point, but you know, he was going to be this leader. And the audience roars and starts clapping, and she turns and says, "Is this how democracy dies?" with thunderous applause. And that came out right after 9/11. There was
Right.
an invasion of Iraq, and the president had gone to Congress and asked him about, you know, allowing this invasion to happen, and everyone stood up and cheered and clapped. And so that was a direct reflection on that. I mean, you know, it's been written about a zillion times. But yeah, I think that there's a lot of that going on. And the fact that Dooku, like you said, gets to a point where he doesn't care. You know, he is totally without any sympathy or emotion for anyone else, and mocking constantly
Mm-hmm.
the people he's fighting.
Right.
And we see that all the time, at least now in our politics. Uh, and
Yeah, it's
it's
a different
dangerous.
sort of villainy. You're right, than sort of Vader, who you can sort of understand Vader's emotions in a kind of way. I mean, he's driven by his passions and his anger for being unable to be, completely love freely, to have the kind of family that he wanted, and then being able to save Amidala, and and
Or
then
his
just
mother as well.
yeah, and his mother, right? And so there's a kind of understanding there of where Vader's kind of drive to be who he is comes from. It sounds like with Dooku is just that he was just mad with power.
He was a privileged person. Obviously, there was probably some scarring for being abandoned by your family as a youth, and
Mm,
being, you know, if you hadn't been found by the Jedi, who knows? He could have been Solo for all we know. You know, kind of a scoundrel. But yeah, there's obviously something he's trying to replace that he's missing,
mm,
in that air of, you know, feeling that you're better than someone else, and for no reason other than that you were born into an aristocratic family.
yeah.
And we see that anyway. We see people like that. I mean, we could think of several examples right now. We don't want to get too political, of people who are born with privileged, don't really have to work in school because their legacies, or they bought the grade in some way, and then feel that they're better than other people because they have money.
Mm, mm-hmm.
There's no intellectual legitimacy to their stand on that, but they think that it gives them uh, some step above others, and that they
Right.
can talk down to people. And
Right.
uh, it's a sad comment on society at large, I think.
Yeah. No, I think interesting in both of these stories that we talk about here, that if I understand correctly, really the villain is power,
Yep,
right? And what
exactly.
power does to people, and the ways that it warps and damages people to become these kinds of beings that are willing to perpetuate all sorts of harm, either for their own self-enjoyment or in the name of some kind of cause that they've envisioned, but usually involves the cost of a lot of other people's lives, which they have no sort of sense of sympathy or empathy with.
It's interesting to go back then to Westworld as well, because
Mm,
these are people who probably in the outside world have to stay within some kind of restraint in the world they live in. But when they go to Westworld, they are without constraint. And so they live out their most wretched fantasies,
right.
you know, usually quite violent. And I'm rich. I can afford the $20,000 to come to Westworld for a week and live out this, you know, weird fantasy that I've developed over the years, and there's going to be no consequences for whatever I
Right.
do.
Yeah. Yeah.
And I think that the same thing probably we're talking about power here on the outside world. And we see people politically who do some really bad things that if anyone that we knew or we did, we would be in front of a court, we would probably be in jail, our lives would be ruined. And yet we sit here and watch television and watch these people get away with everything.
Yeah.
Um,
Yeah.
you know, they say terrible things about other people, they abuse other people, um, and there's no consequences. So how are we who are watching this and viewing this happening, how are we supposed to take that and understand the unequalness of that and really seeing it? Yeah, these people are getting away with everything. I don't think it makes them better than anyone, but it sure allows their power to allows them to abuse whatever station they have, and it's certainly a lack of responsibility and accountability.
Yeah, well, I mean, at least I think what's interesting about the Westworld storyline is that that kind of behavior doesn't go unpunished, right? And so you can't just shoot people in the street and get away with it for too long before the people who are getting shot all the time are going to stand up and try to bring around the downfall of civilization as they see it.
Yep.
At least that's what I sort of see happening in the third season of Westworld, which I haven't, like I said, I haven't seen, and I don't want to give too much away, right? But you see some of that going on at least in season 2 and into season 3. Is that there are consequences for I think what is it? Our dangerous delights. I can't remember Dolores's line about that.
These violent delights have violent ends.
Yeah, exactly. I mean, I think that's a really kind of that's a, you know, and we might talk about this, right? The subversiveness of Westworld in terms of talking about confronting power, because it seems now in talking about this, there seems to be a kind of commentary not only on our world, but a commentary on the kinds of villains that you and I have both been describing, being described here in Star Trek and Star Wars.
I think one of her other really great lines that I think you have to listen to very careful is when she looks at the world when she's brought into it, the more modern, the actual world. She says, "Have you ever seen such splendor?"
Mm, right,
And
right.
not understanding that where she lives is beautiful itself, but this privilege has something that she's not familiar with. And
Yeah,
as she
yeah,
learns what it costs, she realizes that what she had before is more more beautiful.
yeah. Yeah, that's interesting. Well, there's at least two more discussions to have. One about corporate villains and the lessons of Westworld, but I think that's enough for now.
Yeah,
I want to thank you, Randy, for always a pleasure to have great conversations with you, and I appreciate you being willing to set some time away from all your teaching in this kind of remote Zoom world to remake Trek Wars at OSU happen, and in celebration, as we usually do, of May 4th. So, I guess I'll end by saying, even though it's no longer May 4th, but May the 4th be with you, we can sort of
long and
celebrate the
prosper.
week and thank you for your time. And um, let's do some more of this again.
Yeah, and thank you again, Joseph. I mean, it's too bad we didn't have our total cosplay on for our day. And I always tell my students that the best part of my job is I get to learn something new every day. I'm a lifelong learner, and I love our friendship and our ability to have these conversations because I always learn something new. And,
Likewise. I think that's true.
it's
That's
quite
why I
wonderful.
enjoy this a lot. So thanks a lot. I appreciate that very much. Feel the same. Um, and for those of you who are listening to us, thank you for spending some time with us. If you'd like to know more about Trek Wars at OSU, you can look for us on social media at Anarres Project. That's ANARRES Project, all one word. And you can find us on Facebook, you can find us on Twitter, you can find us on Instagram, or you can find us at anarresproject.org. And drop us a note, leave us some comments, and let us know what you think about villainy and our discussions about these franchises and politics. We'd love to hear from you. So thanks once again. Thanks, Randy. I appreciate all your
Thanks,
time, and
Joseph.
we'll see you soon.
Stay shiny.